It carries one of the most iconic names in aviation, Black Hawk.
It did everything we wanted it to do.
Infamous for a tragedy and revered as a lifesaver.
Had this been another type of helicopter, probably none of the crews would have survived.
The UH-60 Black Hawk is Army tough.
It just can give you everything in that split second when you need it.
This is the inside story of how a military workhorse got off the ground and set a new standard for getting in and getting out through the heat of battle. In 2011, America's war in Afghanistan barrels into its 10th year. One of its deadliest places, Kunar province. U.S. attention focuses on its remote Wadapur Valley.
It was a very active insurgent area, especially with it being near the border of Pakistan.
U.S. Army Staff Sergeant Julia Stalker was in Kunar as a flight medic.
It was a very easy place for them to hide out and operate because of the terrain.
On top, coming back down.
U.S. commanders hatch a dangerous plan to attack the Taliban on their home turf. They must prepare for U.S. casualties. Medical teams ready 2 Black Hawk helicopters for airlifting wounded from the heat of battle.
We were going to be very, very busy.
June 25th, high on a ridgeline, Operation Hammerdown opens and meets intense enemy fire. Troops push toward the valley below, but Taliban bullets pin them down.
We got disrupted. We set up a defensive position, and we've just been in the defense.
Already, soldiers are down and in desperate need of help. The Black Hawks swoop into action. The Black Hawk is the go-to helicopter for medics on a mission. And for good reason.
This helicopter that we have right here is our medevac helicopter. It's an UH-60. It's specifically designed for medevac missions.
It fits up to 6 stretchers for the wounded, 2 crew members, and life-saving equipment, all in a cabin of 88 square feet.
So even with our space constraints, I am able to provide care just like almost any emergency room would.
I can defibrillate. I have a ventilator. I can maintain an airway with an ET tube. So essentially, pretty much anything that they do in a trauma ward, I can accomplish on the back of my helicopter.
Medevac Blackhawks can save lives if they can get to the patients. In the Wadapur Valley, 2 Blackhawks race towards the injured. One shot soldier's condition is critical. The longer troops stay put with the wounded, the bigger target they all become. The 2 helicopters arrive over a hot battlefield.
There was small arms fire, RPGs. It was a very, very active battlefield. It's a vision in my mind that will never go away.
Insurgents hit the first Black Hawk. they seriously damage hydraulics critical to flight performance. Pilot muscle alone isn't enough power to control a Black Hawk's main rotor or tail rotor. 2 hydraulic systems, plus a third backup system, run from nose to tail for the heavy lifting. Hydraulic fluid flows through pumps, valves, and lines to supply 3,050 pounds per square inch of pressure. If one system goes down, the backups kick in. But it's only a temporary fix for a potentially lethal problem. With crucial systems gone, the first Black Hawk must return to base. Stalker's medevac helicopter now operates solo.
What was going through my mind was, oh man, we're the only ones left.
Stalker's crew must get the injured soldiers on board. But gunfire below makes it impossible. They hover out of range, around 11,000 feet, and sit tight.
So we had to wait. We burned fuel and we waited for that call that we were going to be able to get in and pull our patients out.
The high altitude would make this waiting game impossible for many helicopters, but not the Black Hawk. 2 GE turboshaft engines put out more than 1,800 horsepower each. They spin 4 blades. Each pair measures a whopping 54 feet from tip to tip. This power keeps the Black Hawk flying, even at dizzying heights. That's comfort in the sky, but Stalker's Black Hawk needs to get on the ground. Casualties mount.
All we needed was about 2 minutes. We needed 2 minutes of it being quiet.
It's bad weather, and as dusk turns to darkness, the danger grows. Night vision goggles are the only way for the crew to see what's going on, but they provide little help under such intense battle conditions.
It made it difficult because all I can see is what I can see down a green little toilet paper tube. If you picture putting a toilet paper tube in front of your face and then having just seen green and black, that's how we operate at nighttime. In addition to all of the fires that had started on the side of the hill, all the active firing with bright light is difficult as well.
Finally, U.S. attack aircraft strike. Enemy fire continues, but it's cover enough for Stalker's Black Hawk to attempt a second rescue.
It was a very precision landing in a very unprecise place.
They find a narrow opening between trees on the side of a mountain and hover with one wheel on the roof of a house, just long enough to load a critically wounded soldier. Stalker's team stabilizes him and gets him to surgery in time to save his life.
It is the coolest aircraft out there for this particular mission.
Stalker credits the Black Hawk for their success. The Army credits her and her crew. They each receive the Distinguished Flying Cross. Over the next 5 days, Black Hawks run more than 30 other missions to pull the dead and wounded from the battle in Wadapur Valley.
It's pretty hard to feel successful in a battlefield environment because there's always the tragedy of it. There's always lives lost. No matter what good outcomes, there's always bad outcomes in an operation like that. I wish I'd gotten to every patient. We all do. But I feel for the most part we had been successful.
Since the Black Hawk was introduced, battlefield survival has risen 75%. The Army Surgeon General identified the need for such an aerial lifesaver in World War II. In the Korean War, helicopter evacuations saved some 40,000 lives. They not only served as air ambulances, they doubled as aerial troop carriers.
Air mobility is a concept that comes out of the 1950s.
Roger Connor is Rotary Wing Curator at the National Air and Space Museum.
Early on, it was called Sky Cavalry, and the idea was just like the horse troops of the Old West. The Army was going to get out there and intercept the enemy before they could get into the cities and cause trouble. And to do that, they needed the helicopter instead of horses.
The need for helicopter support hits home more than ever in the Vietnam War. 1971. America has been caught up in the bloody war in Vietnam for 7 years. The Army has 165,000 troops on the ground and the latest in air transport to get them around. The Army's go-to helicopter is the Bell UH-60 Iroquois, commonly called the Huey.
The Huey had a number of advantages going for it. It was a simple aircraft, and most importantly, it was cheap and easy to build.
The Huey is front and center during almost every battle of the war, making it a prime target.
About 2,500 Hueys, or about half the total that served in Vietnam, were actually shot down at one time or another. And so if the aircraft went down on impact, it was not as survivable as it might be.
The Huey's performance falls short in other ways too. Its engine can't take the heat.
Vietnam was an extremely difficult environment for helicopters. Temperatures were very high, the humidity was often over 95%. To operate in those conditions really required an engine that was going to generate a lot of excess thrust to carry it through that difficult environment.
As the temperature goes up, the Huey's ability to transport troops goes down.
If it was hot and humid, you couldn't carry as many troops on an individual sortie, so you would have to fly more runs to bring more troops in, and that greatly complicated the missions.
Without a way to rapidly move troops, the Army quickly loses ground.
Towards the end of the Vietnam War, the Army realized the Huey was not going to be adequate for its next generation of operations.
January 5th, 1972, Washington, D.C. The Army announces a competition to build a new generation utility and medevac helicopter. It needs to have long-range ability, lift heavy cargo, carry 11 or more fully equipped troops in the back, and serve as an aerial ambulance. It must be able to do all of that in the heat of battle and survive. The new helicopter will eventually replace more than 1,000 Hueys in the Army inventory.
The limitations of the Huey forced the Army to issue new requirements, ones that would deal with the shortcomings in survivability, with the shortcomings in cabin space and in payload, and in speed and in range.
3 well-known names in aviation vie for the prize: Bell, Boeing Vertol, and Sikorsky. Sikorsky is the long shot.
The U.S. Army had been buying thousands of helicopters from Bell and from Boeing during the Vietnam War, but it only bought very small numbers from Sikorsky during that time. So most of the Army program managers of the Pentagon at that time did not see Sikorsky as a realistic contender for their new major competition.
8 months later, the Army narrows the field to 2 designs: Boeing Vertol and Sikorsky. To determine the winner, a fly-off.
The 2 major contenders had to produce a prototype aircraft, and they would fly off. The aircraft that flew best would be the one that usually won.
This strategy leads to a most extraordinary game changer: a crash landing like none before it. The Army gives Boeing Vertol and Sikorsky 4 years for each of them to manufacture a helicopter. The best one will win a contract worth tens of millions.
The Army's philosophy was they would fund the design and development of 2 different helicopters, fly those against each other, and pick the winner for production.
Ray Leone was chief of advanced concepts at Sikorsky Aircraft. Their new helicopter was his baby.
Sikorsky saw it as truly a matter of survival. We had to win, or we were faced with going out of business.
Sikorsky is a company in trouble. Their production lines only operate at 22% capacity. Their very existence depends on them winning the final contract. Sikorsky's strategy is to rigorously test each individual component for survivability before they assemble. They test and improve, straining parts to the breaking point and shooting bullets into almost every section of the airframe. But how will it compare to its competitor? March 1976, Boeing Vertol delivers its prototype, the UH-61A. Its modular design meets all the Army's requirements, and it has a smaller rotor. This may make it cheaper and more versatile in tight spaces.
We knew the Boeing Vertol machine was slightly smaller than ours, so we worried that they may have a leg up on us. But there's no question in our minds that we did the best possible job in delivering to the Army what they truly wanted and needed.
5 months later, at Fort Campbell, Kentucky, the operational stage of the fly-off begins. That means live cargo.
The operational testing consisted of flying simulated troop assault missions, going during the day, flying at night. And it was to put the helicopter in as close to an operational environment as possible, using real troops, real pilots, and just seeing how the aircraft behaved.
August 19th, 1976. In its critical test, the helicopter takes off, loaded with 14 Army personnel. Suddenly, in the middle of the flight, it begins to vibrate uncontrollably.
It was what was called a once per revolution, 1 per rev vibration. Low frequency, but very strong. They felt that since they didn't know what was causing it, and it seemed to be getting worse, they better land as quickly as possible.
Pilots spot a cornfield. It looks ideal for an emergency landing. But in the dark, they get it wrong.
Between the mist and the darkness, they mistook the pine trees for corn stalks.
The helicopter crashes hard into the trees. Aboard, 2 pilots and 12 soldiers.
I answered the phone 1 o'clock in the morning at home, and they said, one of your helicopters just crashed in the woods and was full of Army troops. And I said, well, what were the injuries? Were there any fatalities? And they said, sorry, we can't tell you that. You better get down to Fort Campbell just as quickly as you can.
Leone, rescue teams, and Army investigators race to the scene. It's not what anyone expected.
There were no fatalities. In fact, there were no injuries.
More than that, the helicopter shows little damage.
There was some dents and nicks and tears on the airframe, but nothing substantially wrong.
The cause of the vibration is an easy fix, and 3 days later, the crashed helicopter flies out of the forest and back to base. What could have been its demise becomes a moment of triumph.
The August 1976 crash was one of the few moments in aviation history where